Mitchell, you gave us a fascinating presentation on the probable effect the reforms required by the International Monetary Fund and the European Union would have on Ukraine. You describe them as an opportunity as well as a kind of a trap. Could you tell us more about it?
Well, in the shock doctrine, Naomi Klein writes that the international financial institutions take advantage of situations in which countries are in a deep economic crisis to impose massive economic reforms that she feels are not beneficial largely to the countries, or rather the populations of those countries, but are beneficial more to the elites and to banks in the West. I don't necessarily share that view, but it's very hard to see Ukraine contemporarily as not fitting into this kind of trap that you mentioned, that Ukraine is in a very deep economic crisis. It's absolutely dependent on the IMF and the European Union to pay its own government budget. It's completely dependent on these organizations also to pay its gas bills towards Russia. So at any point, the European Union and the IMF could stop making these payments, and as a result, they have an enormous leverage to force Ukraine to impose very tough economic measures that politicians have been avoiding in that country for some 20, 25 years. So at the same time, where I depart from Naomi Klein is these reforms can be beneficial and have been extremely beneficial in countries like Poland, which is a neighboring country, which had a GDP per capita of approximately the same as Ukraine's in 1990 and is now 3 times richer on a per capita basis. So I don't think one can look at that and say anything but that over time, these reforms and what they resulted in, which is closer relationship with the West and European Union membership, much foreign investment directed towards Europe, they haven't been beneficial. So in essence, there is a sort of trade-off of extreme difficulties and difficult reforms that need to be made now, and potential for long-term payoffs that may be of a similar order to Poland.
But their reforms will be costly for the population. This is sure. We have the experience of Russia and some other countries where these kind of costly economic reforms undermine the support for political reforms. Do you think that there is this kind of risk that the potentially beneficial reform could destroy the political consensus?
Yes, of course, there's always this potential, but I think one of the other factors of the crisis in Ukraine right now is the invasion from Russia, or what we call the hybrid war that Russia is brewing in eastern Ukraine. So that makes it a lot less likely for Ukrainian population to buck the IMF or the European Union, because the alternative is essentially a Russian takeover of the country, which almost happened under the Yanukovych regime and is sort of happening to a certain degree militarily. It's a constant reminder to people that they need to unify around the government in Kiev. And in fact, that's what you've seen in these recent elections, which were very surprising, I thought. I mean, the government is of Poroshenko, who got 60-some% in the presidential election in May. Since that time, he's faced a very difficult situation and many criticisms in terms of his prosecution of the war, in terms of what he's been doing on the ground. Living standards have been falling. And yet you found again in end of October that people, pretty unified vote for parties that were pro-EU, pro-Poroshenko, pro-Yatsenyuk, who's promising all these difficult reforms. So I read that as, again, that Russia has imposed a national consensus in Ukraine, which was lacking before.
A colleague of ours stated that what Maidan asked for was the Europe of values, and what was proposed by Europe was the Europe of rules. Do you think that the actual reforms bring some values, or are just limited to rules?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I've been actually a recipient of an EU grant for EU studies in the United States and administered EU funds. And whenever one's dealing with the European Union, they sort of behave like super accountants, you know. Like every single thing is checked, you know, you have to have your boarding passes on all flights. They're very bureaucratic. And so I can understand why Ukrainians feel that it's a Europe of rules. Another way of looking at it is that the rule of law is the rule by lawyers. And Ukraine's not a country which is very accustomed to rule of law in that sense. So I think that, yes, on a day-to-day or sort of bureaucratic basis, Europe is all about rules. It's super rules. And today, 85% of legislation in Britain comes out of Brussels, and it's just transposed into British legislation. For Ukraine, that proportion will be higher because they don't have, you know, they're not a member yet, and they, you know, they're forced to do all these things, which are very uncomfortable. There's a thorough revolution of all aspects of life in Ukraine. It will be thoroughly revolutionized by this move towards the West. And it doesn't appear to have much to do with values, maybe, except that a lot of values are imbued in these rules. So a lot of them are about transparency standards, about accuracy, about legality, about proper procedure, about public consultation. So yes, it's hard in the forest, you know, to see the forest, you know, for the trees. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.